Marcus Reed's car rolled to a stop on the shoulder of a quiet rural road, somewhere in the American heartland. The engine ticked as it cooled, a stark contrast to the relentless buzz of cicadas in the surrounding fields. Marcus stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a tall man, his posture still ramrod straight despite the years that had passed since his active duty as a Marine. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Marcus squinted against its glare. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the satisfying pop of his joints. The drive had been long and his body ached from hours of sitting. As he twisted his torso, trying to work out the kinks in his back, he caught sight of his reflection in the car window. The man staring back at him looked tired, older than his years. Dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and the lines etched around his mouth told of battles fought both on and off the battlefield. Marcus took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the warm summer air. He held it for a moment before exhaling slowly, a technique he'd learned to calm his nerves. It was supposed to help with the memories, the flashbacks that still plagued him years after his last tour. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Today it seemed to be one of those days when the past refused to stay buried. As he breathed, Marcus tried to focus on his surroundings, grounding himself in the present. The endless expanse of cornfields stretched out on either side of the road, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or barn in the distance. It was peaceful here, far removed from the chaos and violence of war zones. Yet even in this tranquil setting, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being on edge, always alert, always watching. His gaze swept the area, an old habit he couldn't break. That's when he noticed them, a man and a girl standing by a beaten-up pickup truck about 50 yards down the road. Under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have caught his attention. But something about the scene made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, was small for her age. Her dark skin contrasted sharply with the bright yellow sundress she wore. But it was her body language that set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. She stood rigid, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself as small as possible. Her eyes darted around nervously, never settling on one spot for too long. The man with her was older, probably in his 50s, with a paunch that hung over his belt and thinning gray hair. He had a firm grip on the girl's arm, his fingers digging into her skin. His posture was relaxed, almost nonchalant. But there was something predatory in the way he glanced around, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men who thought they were above the law, who believed they could take whatever they wanted without consequences. As Marcus watched, the girl made a subtle movement that nearly stopped his heart. She raised her hand slightly, palm facing down, and tapped her thigh twice before letting her hand fall back to her side. To anyone else, it might have looked like a nervous tick, a meaningless gesture. But Marcus recognized it immediately. It was a distress signal, one that he and his fellow Marines had used in situations where they couldn't openly call for help. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a suspicious situation, it was a cry for help. The girl was trying to communicate without alerting the man beside her. She was scared, trapped, and reaching out to anyone who might understand. Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins, his body tensing as if preparing for combat. His mind raced, assessing the situation, weighing his options. He knew he couldn't just charge in without a plan. That could put the girl in even more danger. But he also couldn't stand by and do nothing. As he stood there, frozen in indecision, the girl's eyes met his for a brief moment. In that fleeting contact, Marcus saw a mixture of fear and desperate hope. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of civilians caught in war zones, people who had nothing left but the faint hope that someone, anyone, would help them. That look shattered the last of Marcus's hesitation. He knew with absolute certainty that he had to act. Whatever was happening here, whatever danger this girl was in, he couldn't walk away. The memories of combat that had been plaguing him moments ago faded into the background, replaced by a laser-like focus on the present situation. Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He didn't know exactly what he was walking into, but he knew he couldn't ignore this warning sign. As he began to move towards the pair, his mind was already formulating a plan. He would approach casually, try to engage them in conversation, and look for an opportunity to separate the girl from the man. With each step, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He didn't know who this girl was, or what her story might be, but in that moment, he made a silent promise to her and to himself. He would do whatever it took to help her, to keep her safe. The path ahead was uncertain, potentially dangerous, but Marcus knew he had no choice. He had been given a sign, a call for help, and he would answer it, no matter the cost. Marcus approached the pair slowly, his posture deliberately relaxed despite the tension coiling in his muscles. He kept his hands visible, knowing that sudden movements could escalate the situation. As he drew closer, he could see the girl's eyes widen slightly, a mix of hope and fear flickering across her face. "Afternoon?" Marcus called out, his voice casual but firm. "Beautiful day for a drive, isn't it?" The man's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Marcus. His grip on the girl's arm tightened almost imperceptibly, but Marcus caught the motion. The girl winced but remained silent. "Sure is," the man replied, his tone guarded. "Just taking my niece for a little road trip. Ain't that right, sweetheart?" The girl nodded mechanically, her eyes fixed on the ground. Marcus noted the lack of family resemblance, the girl's discomfort, and the man's overly familiar tone. Every instinct he had honed in the Marines screamed that this was wrong. "That sounds nice," Marcus said, maintaining his friendly facade. He turned his attention to the girl, crouching down slightly to meet her eye level. "What's your name, sweetie?" Before the girl could answer, the man cut in. "Her name's Lisa. She's a bit shy around strangers. We should really be going now." Marcus nodded but made no move to leave. Instead, he directed his next words to the girl. "You know, Lisa, I used to be a Marine. We had this special sign we'd use if we ever needed help but couldn't say it out loud. It looked a lot like what you did earlier. Do you know what I'm talking about?" The girl's head snapped up, her eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time. There was a flash of recognition, of desperate hope. The man's face darkened, his body tensing as he realized the game was up. "I don't know what you're talking about, mister, but we're leaving now," the man growled, tugging the girl towards the truck. Marcus straightened up, his demeanor changing in an instant. Gone was the friendly stranger, replaced by the Marine, alert and ready for action. "I don't think so," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The girl stays here." The man's hand moved towards his waistband, but Marcus was faster. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, gripping the man's wrist and twisting it behind his back. The man yelped in pain, releasing his hold on the girl. "Run to my car," Marcus ordered the girl, who hesitated for only a second before bolting towards the safety of Marcus's vehicle. With his free hand, Marcus pulled out his phone, quickly dialing 911. "This is Marcus Reed, former Marine. I'm on Highway 20, mile marker 156. I've got a suspected child abductor here. Need immediate assistance." The dispatcher assured him help was on the way. Marcus kept the man pinned, his military training kicking in as he maintained control of the situation. The man struggled and cursed, but Marcus's grip was unyielding. In the distance, Marcus could hear the wail of approaching sirens. He glanced over at his car, where the girl sat huddled in the passenger seat, watching the scene with wide, frightened eyes. Despite the chaos of the moment, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had acted in time. The girl was safe. As the police cars pulled up, lights flashing, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline begin to subside. Officers quickly took control of the situation, handcuffing the man and leading him to a patrol car. A female officer approached the girl in Marcus's car, speaking to her in soft, reassuring tones. Marcus watched as the girl was gently coaxed from his vehicle and led to an ambulance that had arrived on the scene. As she passed by him, she paused for a moment, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "You're safe now," he assured her, watching as she was led away for medical attention. As the scene unfolded around him, Marcus found himself giving a statement to one of the officers. He recounted the events, from noticing the suspicious behavior to recognizing the distress signal. The officer commended him for his quick thinking and bravery, but even as he received praise, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The girl was safe for now, but what would happen to her next? Where had she come from, and what kind of life was she returning to? The questions swirled in his mind, along with a growing sense of responsibility. As the last of the police cars pulled away, Marcus stood alone on the side of the road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cornfields. He should have felt relieved, triumphant even. He had potentially saved a young girl from a terrible fate, but instead he felt a gnawing unease. The encounter had stirred something in him, awakening feelings and memories he had long tried to suppress. The girl's frightened eyes, her silent plea for help, reminded him of other children he had encountered in war-torn countries. Children who had looked to him and his fellow Marines for protection, for salvation. Marcus realized that he couldn't simply drive away and forget about this. He had been given a sign, a call to action. And just as he had answered the call to serve his country, he knew he had to answer this call too. With a heavy sigh, Marcus got back into his car. But instead of continuing on his journey, he turned around, heading back towards the town he had passed through earlier. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he had to do something. The girl's whispered, "Thank you," echoed in his mind, driving him forward. As he drove, Marcus felt a sense of purpose settling over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since leaving the Marines. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The road ahead was uncertain, but Marcus was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had received his warning sign, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Marcus pulled into the parking lot of the local police station, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he couldn't simply walk away from what had happened. The image of the girl's frightened face was seared into his memory, driving him to action. As he entered the station, the buzz of activity hit him. Officers moved purposefully, phones rang, and the air was thick with tension. Marcus approached the front desk, where a harried-looking officer glanced up at him. "Can I help you?" the officer asked, his tone brusque but not unkind. Marcus straightened his posture, falling back on his military bearing. "I'm Marcus Reed. I called in the suspected child abduction on Highway 20 earlier today. I was hoping to get an update on the situation." Recognition flashed in the officer's eyes. "Mr. Reed, of course. Detective Sanchez is handling the case. I'll see if she's available to speak with you." As Marcus waited, he observed the station. The walls were lined with wanted posters and community notices. A group of officers huddled around a computer, their faces grim as they discussed something in low voices. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of urgency that Marcus found all too familiar. "Mr. Reed?" A voice cut through his thoughts. He turned to see a woman approaching, her badge identifying her as Detective Sanchez. "I'm handling the case you called in. Would you mind stepping into my office?" Marcus followed her into a small, cluttered room. Files and photographs covered every surface, testament to the never-ending nature of police work. Detective Sanchez gestured for him to take a seat before settling behind her desk. "First, I want to thank you for your quick action today," she began. "You potentially saved that girl from a terrible fate." Marcus nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone would do. How is she? Detective Sanchez's expression turned serious. Her name is Kira, not Lisa, as the suspect claimed. She's physically unharmed, but understandably shaken. We've placed her in emergency foster care for now. And the man? Marcus asked, his jaw clenching at the memory. In custody. We're running his prints, but preliminary investigation suggests he's part of a larger trafficking ring. Your intervention may have blown open a much bigger case. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Trafficking. The term conjured images of war-torn countries and desperate refugees. To think it was happening here, in the heartland of America, was shocking. What happens now? Marcus asked, leaning forward in his chair. Detective Sanchez sighed, running a hand through her hair. We investigate. We try to find out where Kira came from, who her family is, and we dig deeper into this trafficking ring. But it's not going to be easy. These operations are notoriously difficult to crack. Marcus nodded, his mind already working. He'd seen similar operations during his time in the Marines, had even been part of teams that disrupted them. But this was different. This was home. Is there anything I can do to help? He found himself asking before he could think better of it. Detective Sanchez studied him for a moment. You've already done more than most civilians would, but Kira seems to trust you. She's been asking about you. If you're willing, it might help if you could spend some time with her. Help her feel safe enough to open up about what happened to her. Marcus felt a mix of emotions at the suggestion. Part of him wanted to get back in his car and drive away, to leave this mess behind, but a stronger part, the part that had driven him to enlist in the Marines all those years ago, knew he couldn't walk away. I'd be willing to do that, he said finally. Whatever I can do to help. Detective Sanchez nodded, relief evident on her face. Thank you, I'll make the arrangements. And Mr. Reed, be prepared. Cases like these, they have a way of sticking with you. As Marcus left the station, the weight of what he'd agreed to settled on his shoulders. He knew he was stepping into something much bigger than he'd anticipated when he'd first stopped on that rural road. But as he climbed into his car, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. The sun was setting as Marcus drove to the motel where he'd decided to stay. The peaceful farmland that had surrounded him earlier now seemed to hide dark secrets. He couldn't help but wonder how many other children like Kira were out there, silently pleading for help. As he pulled into the motel parking lot, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Sanchez. It contained an address and a time for him to meet Kira the next day. Looking at the message, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and apprehension. He didn't know what to expect, how to talk to a traumatized child, or even if he could truly help. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of his motel room, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He had been given a sign, a call to action. And just as he had done in the Marines, he would answer that call no matter where it led him. The memory of Kira's whispered "thank you" echoed in his mind as he drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, Marcus felt ready to face them. He had a new mission now, and failure was not an option. The next morning, Marcus found himself standing outside a nondescript building that housed the local child services office. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was a stark contrast to the police station. Bright posters adorned the walls, and toys were scattered in a play area near the reception desk. A middle-aged woman looked up as Marcus approached, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said, rising to greet him. "I'm Susan, Kira's caseworker. Detective Sanchez told me you'd be coming. Thank you for doing this." Marcus nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "How is she?" he managed to ask. Susan's smile faltered slightly. As well as can be expected, given the circumstances. She's been through a lot, Mr. Reed. More than any child should have to endure. She led Marcus down a hallway to a small room. Through the window in the door, he could see Kira sitting at a table, her small frame hunched over a piece of paper as she drew intently. "Just be patient with her," Susan advised softly. "She may not want to talk much at first. That's okay. Sometimes just being there is enough." With that, she opened the door and ushered Marcus inside. Kira's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes widening as she recognized him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, to Marcus's surprise, Kira stood up and walked over to him. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around his waist in a tight hug. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he gently returned the embrace, acutely aware of how small and fragile she felt. "You came," Kira whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Of course I did," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you were safe now, remember?" Kira nodded, stepping back to look up at him. Her eyes, which had seemed so frightened and hopeless on the roadside, now held a spark of something Marcus recognized all too well: resilience. "Do you want to see what I'm drawing?" she asked, gesturing to the table. Marcus nodded, allowing Kira to lead him to her artwork. As they sat down together, he was struck by how quickly she seemed to trust him. It was both heartening and heartbreaking, a testament to her strength and a stark reminder of what she'd been through. The drawing was a chaotic mix of dark and light colors. Shadowy figures loomed at the edges, but in the center was a bright yellow sun. Beneath it, two stick figures stood hand in hand. "That's you," Kira said, pointing to the taller figure. "And that's me. You saved me from the bad men." Marcus swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "You saved yourself too, Kira," he said finally. "You were very brave to signal for help like that." Kira shrugged, her small shoulders rising and falling. "I learned it from a TV show. I didn't think anyone would understand." "But I did," Marcus said softly, "and I'm glad I was there to help." They spent the next hour talking, Kira gradually opening up about her experiences. She spoke of a troubled home life, of running away, of men who promised her a better life but delivered only pain and fear. Marcus listened, his heart breaking for this child who had endured so much. As their time came to an end, Kira looked up at Marcus with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years. "Will you come back?" she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. Marcus didn't hesitate. "As often as they'll let me," he promised. As he left the building, Marcus felt a tumult of emotions. Anger at those who had hurt Kira, determination to see justice done, and an overwhelming sense of protectiveness towards this resilient young girl. He met with Detective Sanchez later that day, sharing what Kira had told him. The detective listened intently, her face grim as she took notes. "This is good, Mr. Reed," she said when he finished. "It's more than we've been able to get so far, but we're just scratching the surface of this operation. There are likely more children out there in similar situations." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought of Kira's drawing, of the shadowy figures that still haunted her. How many other children were living that nightmare right now? "What can I do?" he asked, his voice hard with determination. Detective Sanchez studied him for a moment before responding. "We could use someone with your background, Mr. Reed, your military experience, your ability to recognize and respond to danger signals. Would you consider working with us in a more official capacity?" Marcus didn't need to think about it. The sense of purpose that had been growing since he'd first spotted Kira on the roadside crystallized into a clear path forward. "Yes," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes to help these kids." As he drove back to his motel that night, Marcus felt a shift within himself. The restlessness that had plagued him since leaving the Marines, the sense of being adrift without a mission, was gone. In its place was a fierce determination. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to make a difference in a way he never expected. And as he thought of Kira's resilient spirit, of her simple trust in him, Marcus knew he would do whatever it took to live up to that trust. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt ready to face those challenges head-on. He had found his new mission, and he would see it through to the end. Over the next few weeks, Marcus became a fixture at the Child Services Center. He visited Kira regularly, their bond growing stronger with each interaction. But he didn't stop there. As word spread of his involvement, other children at the center began to gravitate towards him, drawn to his calm demeanor and patient listening. One particularly rainy afternoon, Marcus found himself surrounded by a small group of children, including Kira. They were gathered in the center's common room, a space filled with worn but comfortable furniture and shelves lined with books and games. "Tell us a story, Marcus," one of the younger boys pleaded, his eyes wide with anticipation. Marcus hesitated, acutely aware of the fragile minds before him. He couldn't share the harsh realities of his military experiences, but he understood their need for tales of bravery and hope. "All right," he said, settling into a chair as the children gathered around. "Let me tell you about a time when my team and I helped a village rebuild after a big storm." As he spoke, weaving a tale of teamwork and resilience, Marcus watched the children's faces. They hung on his every word, their own troubles momentarily forgotten. Kira, sitting closest to him, seemed to drink in every detail, her eyes shining with a mix of admiration and something deeper, understanding. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before erupting into excited chatter. The children began to share their own stories of overcoming challenges, each tale bolstering their collective strength. Later, as the group dispersed for dinner, Kira lingered behind. "Marcus," she said softly, "I want to be brave like you when I grow up." The words hit Marcus hard, a reminder of the influence he now held. "You already are brave, Kira," he replied, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared." Kira nodded, absorbing his words. Then with a sudden burst of energy, she ran to a nearby shelf and returned with a sketchbook and some colored pencils. "Can we draw together?" she asked. For the next hour, they sat side by side, filling pages with colorful creations. Kira's drawings, once dominated by dark shadows, now featured bright landscapes and smiling figures. It was a small change, but to Marcus it represented a world of progress. As he was leaving that evening, Marcus ran into Susan, Kira's caseworker. The worry lines that usually creased her forehead were less pronounced, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're making a real difference here, Marcus," she said, gesturing towards the room where children's laughter could still be heard. "They trust you. And for kids who've been through what they have, trust is a rare and precious thing." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "They're incredible kids," he said. "They've been through so much, but they still find reasons to smile." Susan's expression turned serious. "That's why what you're doing with Detective Sanchez is so important. These kids need a chance at a real future free from fear." Marcus had indeed been working closely with Detective Sanchez, using his military experience to help track down leads on the trafficking ring. It was slow, painstaking work, often leading to dead ends and frustration. But every time he looked at Kira and the other children, he found renewed determination. "We're making progress," he assured Susan. "Slow progress, but progress nonetheless." As he drove home that night, Marcus reflected on the changes in his own life. The nightmares that had plagued him since his military days were less frequent now, replaced by dreams of the children's laughter and Kira's brightening drawings. He thought about the story he'd told the children, of rebuilding after a storm. In many ways, that's what he was doing now, helping these kids rebuild their lives, their trust, their hope. And in the process, he realized he was rebuilding himself too. The next morning, Marcus woke early, energized despite the long hours he'd been putting in. He had a meeting with Detective Sanchez to go over some new leads, and then he was due back at the center for an art therapy session with Kira and some of the other children. As he got ready, Marcus caught sight of himself in the mirror. The man looking back at him was different from the one who had stopped on that rural road weeks ago. There was a purpose in his eyes now, a determination in the set of his jaw. He was no longer adrift, no longer haunted by the ghosts of his past. Instead, he was focused on the future, not just his own, but the futures of Kira and all the other children who had been dealt a harsh hand by life. As he headed out the door, Marcus felt a sense of anticipation. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them. With every small victory, every smile coaxed from a traumatized child, every lead that brought them closer to dismantling the trafficking ring, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The war he was fighting now was different from the ones he'd faced as a Marine, but in many ways it was just as important. And this time Marcus was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what it took. The investigation into the trafficking ring was gaining momentum. Marcus found himself spending more time at the police station, poring over files and surveillance footage with Detective Sanchez. His military training proved invaluable as they pieced together the complex web of the operation. One evening, as they were wrapping up a particularly long session, Detective Sanchez leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. "You know, Reed," she said, "I've been meaning to ask, what made you stick around? Most people would have given their statement and moved on." Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I couldn't walk away," he finally said, "not after seeing Kira's face, knowing what she'd been through, and then meeting the other kids." He trailed off, lost in thought. Sanchez nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It gets to you, doesn't it? These cases, they stick with you." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, his voice low. "But it's more than that. For a long time after I left the Marines, I felt lost, like I didn't have a purpose anymore. But now you have a new mission," Sanchez finished for him. Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Exactly. As he drove home that night, Marcus's mind wandered to the group therapy session he'd attended at the center earlier that week. The counselor had encouraged the children to share their experiences, to give voice to their fears and hopes. Marcus had sat in the back, there as a supportive presence rather than a participant. But as he listened to the children speak, he found himself reflecting on his own struggles. The nightmares that had plagued him since his time in combat, the hypervigilance that made every loud noise a potential threat, the guilt over comrades lost. These were burdens he'd carried alone for too long. Lost in these thoughts, Marcus almost missed the turn to his apartment. As he parked his car, a decision crystallized in his mind. It was time to face his own demons, to deal with the trauma he'd been carrying for years. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the center earlier than usual. He caught Susan just as she was unlocking the doors. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, his voice determined despite the nervousness churning in his gut. Susan listened patiently as Marcus explained his desire to join one of the adult support groups. Her face softened with understanding and something that looked like pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Marcus," she said warmly. "It takes a lot of courage to ask for help. The kids aren't the only ones who need healing." That afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting in a circle of chairs, surrounded by other adults who had experienced trauma. As each person shared their story, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: empathy for their pain, admiration for their strength, and a growing sense of connection. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus took a deep breath. His voice was shaky at first as he began to talk about his experiences in the Marines, the things he'd seen and done, the losses he'd endured. But as he continued, his voice grew stronger. He spoke of the nightmares, the guilt, the feeling of being adrift in civilian life. And then he talked about Kira, about how helping her and the other children had given him a new purpose. As he finished speaking, Marcus looked around the circle. There were tears in some eyes, nods of understanding from others. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the burden of carrying these experiences alone finally shared. After the session, as people were filing out, Kira's face appeared in the doorway. She must have been waiting for him. Without a word, she walked over and gave him a hug. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shirt. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm okay. Sometimes grown-ups need help too, you know?" Kira looked up at him, her eyes wise beyond her years. "I know," she said simply. "That's why we have each other, right?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, he said, "That's right, Kira. We help each other." As they walked out of the room together, Marcus felt a shift within himself. He had taken a crucial step in his own healing journey, and in doing so, he realized he had become an even better support for Kira and the other children. The path ahead was still challenging. The investigation into the trafficking ring was far from over, and both he and the children had a lot of healing left to do. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt truly hopeful about the future. He had found not just a new purpose, but a community, a place where he could both give and receive support, where he could use his experiences, even the painful ones, to help others. As he watched Kira skip ahead to join some of the other children, Marcus felt a renewed sense of determination. He was no longer just fighting for these kids, he was healing alongside them, and together they were all growing stronger. As summer turned to fall, Marcus's involvement with the Child Services Center and the ongoing investigation deepened. His days were filled with a mix of strategy meetings with Detective Sanchez, counseling sessions with the children, and his own therapy appointments. The work was challenging, often emotionally draining, but Marcus found it more fulfilling than anything he'd done since leaving the Marines. One crisp October morning, Marcus arrived at the center to find an air of excitement buzzing through the halls. Susan greeted him with a bright smile. "We're having a fall festival this weekend," she explained. "It's a chance for the kids to just be kids for a day, you know? And we thought, well, we were hoping you might help organize some activities." Marcus felt a mixture of enthusiasm and apprehension. "I'm not exactly an expert on kids' parties," he admitted. Susan laughed. "None of us are, Marcus. But these kids trust you. Your presence alone will make a difference." As Marcus walked through the center, he could see the children's excitement building. Kira ran up to him, her eyes shining. "Marcus, are you going to be at the festival? Please say you will." Looking down at her hopeful face, Marcus couldn't help but smile. "Of course I'll be there," he assured her. "In fact, I'm going to help plan some of the activities. Any suggestions?" Kira's face lit up and she immediately launched into a list of ideas, from face painting to a scavenger hunt. As other children gathered around, adding their own suggestions, Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest. These kids who had been through so much still had the capacity for such joy and excitement. Over the next few days, Marcus threw himself into festival preparations with the same dedication he'd once applied to military operations. He coordinated with local businesses for donations, organized volunteers, and even convinced some of his former Marine buddies to help out. The day of the festival dawned bright and clear. As Marcus helped set up the center's backyard, he watched the children arrive, their faces filled with wonder at the colorful decorations and activity booths. Kira found him almost immediately, tugging on his hand. "Come on, Marcus, you have to try the face painting." Before he knew it, Marcus found himself sitting in a small chair, a volunteer carefully painting a lion on his cheek. The absurdity of the situation, a former Marine turned child advocate with a face full of paint, wasn't lost on him and he found himself laughing along with the children. As the day progressed, Marcus moved from activity to activity, helping where needed and simply enjoying the children's laughter. He supervised the apple bobbing, cheered on participants in the sack race, and even found himself telling stories around a small bonfire as the evening drew in. It was during one of these quiet moments, as he watched the firelight flicker on the children's faces, that Marcus felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Detective Sanchez, her expression a mix of apology and urgency. "Sorry to interrupt," she said softly, "but we've got a lead, a big one. Can you step away for a moment?" Marcus nodded, excusing himself from the group. As they walked to a quiet corner of the yard, Sanchez filled him in. Their months of investigation had finally paid off. They had solid information on a major player in the trafficking ring, someone who could potentially bring down the entire operation. "We're planning a raid," Sanchez explained. "Your insight would be invaluable in the planning stage." Marcus felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the call to action that had driven him throughout his military career. But as he glanced back at the children gathered around the fire, he also felt a pang of conflicting emotion. "When do you need me?" he asked. "We're briefing tomorrow morning. I know it's short notice, but—" "I'll be there," Marcus cut her off. "Just give me a few more hours here. These kids, they deserve this day." Sanchez nodded, understanding in her eyes. As she left, Marcus took a deep breath, pushing the weight of the impending operation to the back of his mind. He had a job to do here first. Returning to the bonfire, Marcus settled back into his spot. Kira, noticing his brief absence, scooted closer to him. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice low. Marcus smiled down at her, marveling at her perceptiveness. "Everything's fine," he assured her. "Just grown-up stuff. Now, where were we in our story?" As he continued the tale, weaving a narrative of bravery and perseverance, Marcus looked around at the children's faces. Each of them had been through so much, had faced fears and challenges no child should have to face. Yet here they were, laughing and enjoying a simple fall evening. In that moment, Marcus felt the full weight of his commitment to these children, to this cause. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a return to the grim reality of the trafficking world they were fighting against. But tonight, in this moment, he could give these kids what they deserved, a chance to just be children, safe and happy. As the festival wound down and children began to leave with their foster families or caseworkers, Kira lingered behind. She threw her arms around Marcus in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "This was the best day ever." Marcus hugged her back, his throat tight with emotion. "You're welcome, kiddo," he said softly. "You all deserve days like this." As he watched Kira skip away to join her foster family, Marcus steeled himself for what lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring a new battle in their ongoing war against the trafficking ring. But tonight had reminded him exactly why they were fighting. For Kira, for all these children, and for the countless others still out there needing help. With renewed determination, Marcus began to clean up the festival grounds. Tomorrow would come soon enough, with all its challenges and dangers. But he was ready to face it, carrying with him the memory of children's laughter and the warmth of a perfect fall day. The next morning, Marcus found himself in a cramped conference room at the police station, surrounded by a mix of local officers and FBI agents. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the gravity of the operation they were about to undertake. Detective Sanchez stood at the front of the room, her face serious as she laid out the details of their target. "James Harrigan," she said, pinning a photo to the board. "Mid-level operator in the trafficking ring, but our intel suggests he's looking to move up. He's got connections we need." As Sanchez continued her briefing, Marcus studied the photo. Harrigan looked unremarkable, the kind of face you'd pass on the street without a second glance. It was a stark reminder that evil often wore the most ordinary of masks. When Sanchez finished, she turned to Marcus. Reed, you've got experience with this kind of operation. What's your take? Marcus stood, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He'd been in similar situations before, planning raids in far-flung corners of the world, but this was different. This was personal. Harrigan's smart, Marcus began, his voice steady. He's managed to stay under the radar this long for a reason. We need to be prepared for anything. For the next hour, Marcus walked the team through potential scenarios, drawing on his military experience to anticipate possible complications. As he spoke, he could see the respect in the eyes of the officers and agents. They recognized the value of his expertise. As the meeting wrapped up, Sanchez pulled Marcus aside. "We want you on site for the raid," she said. "Not directly involved, but close by. Your insights could be crucial if things go sideways." Marcus nodded, a mix of anticipation and anxiety churning in his gut. "I'll be there," he assured her. The day of the raid dawned gray and drizzly. Marcus sat in an unmarked van a block away from Harrigan's suspected hideout, listening to the chatter on the police radio. His body thrummed with tension, muscle memory from countless operations kicking in. "All units in position," crackled a voice over the radio. "On my mark. Now." Marcus listened intently as the operation unfolded. The sounds of doors being breached, shouts of police and FBI, the controlled chaos of a well-executed raid. For a moment he was transported back to his days in the Marines, the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Then a shout that made his blood run cold. "We've got kids here! Multiple minors on site!" Without thinking, Marcus was out of the van and moving towards the building. He knew he was breaking protocol, but the thought of children trapped in that house overrode everything else. As he approached, he saw officers leading out a group of shell-shocked children. Their faces were a mix of fear and confusion, and Marcus felt a surge of anger towards Harrigan and his accomplices. One of the last children to emerge was a girl who couldn't have been more than 12. As she stepped out into the rain, she looked up, her eyes meeting Marcus's. In that moment, he saw Kira's face superimposed over hers, a stark reminder of what they were fighting for. The girl stumbled, overwhelmed by the chaos around her. Marcus moved forward instinctively, catching her before she fell. "It's okay," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The girl looked at him, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She didn't speak, but Marcus saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. As paramedics approached to check on the children, Marcus stood back, watching as they were gently led to waiting ambulances. He caught sight of Sanchez, who gave him a nod of understanding. They both knew he shouldn't have been there, but neither of them regretted his presence. Hours later, as the last of the evidence was being catalogued and the children were safely in the care of child services, Marcus sat on the curb, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. Sanchez approached, handing him a cup of coffee. "You did good today, Reed," she said, settling beside him. "We got Harrigan, and more importantly, we got those kids out." Marcus nodded, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "It's a start," he said, "but there's still so much more to do." Sanchez sighed, her fatigue evident. There always is, but days like today, they remind us why we do this. As they sat in companionable silence, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from Susan at the Child Services Center. "Heard about the raid. The kids are asking for you, Kira especially. Come when you can." Marcus felt a smile tug at his lips despite his exhaustion. He showed the message to Sanchez, who chuckled. "Go on," she said. "We can handle the paperwork. Those kids need you more than we do right now." As Marcus stood to leave, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today had been a victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war. There were more children out there who needed help, more traffickers to be brought to justice. But for now, he had a group of kids waiting for him, kids who needed reassurance and hope. As he drove towards the center, Marcus realized that this, being there for these children, helping them heal and grow, was perhaps the most important mission of his life. The rain had stopped by the time he reached the center, and a weak sun was peeking through the clouds. It felt symbolic somehow, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, light could still break through. The aftermath of the raid brought a whirlwind of activity. Marcus found himself shuttling between the police station, where he assisted with debriefings and paperwork, and the Child Services Center, where the rescued children were being cared for. One afternoon, about a week after the raid, Marcus sat in a small conference room at the courthouse. The air was thick with tension as he waited alongside Detective Sanchez and the prosecuting attorney. They were preparing for Harrigan's arraignment, and Marcus had been called in to provide additional context based on his observations during and after the raid. "Mr. Reed," the prosecutor began, her voice sharp and focused, "your background gives you a unique perspective on this case. Can you walk us through what you observed during the operation?" Marcus took a deep breath, centering himself before he spoke. He described the raid in detail, from the moment they breached the house to the discovery of the children. His voice remained steady, but his hands clenched into fists under the table as he recounted the fear in the children's eyes. As he finished, the prosecutor nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "Your testimony could be crucial in ensuring Harrigan doesn't see the light of day for a very long time." Just then, there was a knock at the door. An assistant poked her head in, her face grim. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. Harrigan's lawyer is pushing for a plea deal. They're offering information on higher-ups in the trafficking ring in exchange for a reduced sentence." The room erupted into heated discussion. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. A plea deal could mean bringing down more of the trafficking network, potentially saving more children. But it also meant Harrigan might get off easier than he deserved. As the debate raged on, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a message from Susan. "Kira's asking for you. She's having a tough day." Marcus excused himself and stepped into the hallway to call Susan. "What's going on?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "She had a nightmare last night," Susan explained. "She's been on edge all day. I think hearing about the raid and the other children has brought up some difficult memories for her." Marcus felt torn. He knew his presence here at the courthouse was important, but Kira needed him too. As he stood there, conflicted, he remembered something his old Marine commander used to say. "Sometimes the most important battle isn't the one you're fighting, but the one you choose to fight." Making up his mind, Marcus returned to the conference room. "I'm sorry," he said, addressing the group, "but I need to go. There's a child who needs me right now." Detective Sanchez nodded understanding, while the prosecutor looked frustrated but didn't argue. As Marcus left, he heard them resume their debate about the plea deal. Driving to the center, Marcus reflected on the complexity of the situation. The legal proceedings were crucial in bringing down the trafficking ring, but the children, their healing, their futures, that was the heart of why they were fighting this battle. When he arrived at the center, he found Kira curled up in a corner of the playroom, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. As he approached, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Hey, kiddo," Marcus said softly, settling down next to her. "Tough day, huh?" Kira nodded, sniffling. "I keep thinking about the bad men," she whispered. "What if they come back?" Marcus felt his heart clench. He wanted to promise her that she'd never have to worry about that again, but he knew better than to make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he opted for honesty. "I can't promise that bad things will never happen again, Kira," he said gently. "But I can promise you this. You're not alone anymore. You've got me and Susan and a whole lot of other people who are going to do everything we can to keep you safe." Kira looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You left an important meeting to come here, didn't you?" she asked, surprising him with her perceptiveness. Marcus nodded. "I did. Because you're important, Kira. More important than any meeting." Kira was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then slowly she uncurled from her tight ball and leaned against Marcus's side. "Can you tell me a story?" she asked, her voice small but steady. As Marcus began to weave a tale of bravery and hope, he felt some of the tension leave Kira's body. He knew that her healing journey was far from over, that there would be more tough days ahead. But he also knew that she was resilient, stronger than she realized. Later that evening, as Marcus was leaving the center, his phone rang. It was Detective Sanchez. "Thought you'd want to know," she said without preamble. "We're not taking the plea deal. We're going after Harrigan with everything we've got." Marcus felt a mix of emotions: satisfaction that Harrigan wouldn't get off easy, concern about the lost opportunity to get more information. But as he glanced back at the center, where he could see Kira waving goodbye through the window, he knew they'd made the right choice. "Good," he said firmly. "Let's show them we mean business." As he drove home, Marcus felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. The fight was far from over, but today, in ways both big and small, they'd won important battles. For Harrigan's victims, for Kira, and for all the children still out there waiting to be rescued, they would keep fighting. And Marcus knew with a certainty that ran bone deep that this was exactly where he was meant to be. Months passed, and the case against Harrigan progressed slowly through the legal system. Marcus divided his time between assisting with the prosecution and his work at the Child Services Center. The children rescued from Harrigan's operation were gradually being placed in foster homes or reunited with family members, but the emotional scars ran deep. One crisp morning in early spring, Marcus arrived at the center to find an unusual level of activity. Susan met him at the door, her face a mix of concern and determination. "We've got a situation," she said, leading him to her office. "Remember that anonymous tip line we set up after the Harrigan raid? Well, it's paid off. We received a call late last night about a potential trafficking operation in a nearby county." Marcus felt his body tense, old instincts kicking in. "Have you contacted Sanchez?" Susan nodded. "She's mobilizing a team as we speak. But Marcus, there's more." She paused, taking a deep breath. "The caller. We think it might be one of Harrigan's former associates. Someone looking to cut a deal before they get caught." The implications hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. If this was true, it could blow the entire trafficking network wide open. But it also meant they were dealing with someone who knew how to play the system, someone who might be setting a trap. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked, his mind already racing through potential scenarios. "Sanchez wants you on site for the operation. Your experience with Harrigan's case could be crucial, but..." Susan hesitated, her eyes flicking towards the door. "Kira overheard me on the phone. She knows something's going on and she's scared." Marcus nodded, understanding the delicate balance he needed to strike. "I'll talk to her before I go." He found Kira in the art room, furiously scribbling with a black crayon. As he approached, he could see that her drawing was a chaotic swirl of dark lines, punctuated by small, trapped figures. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, settling into a chair beside her. "Rough morning?" Kira didn't look up, but her hand stilled. "You're going after more bad men, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus felt a pang in his chest. He'd promised Kira honesty, and he wouldn't break that trust now. "Yes," he said, "but I'll be careful and I'll come back. I promise." Kira finally looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "What if you don't? What if the bad men hurt you like they hurt us?" The fear in her voice was palpable, and Marcus had to resist the urge to simply reassure her that everything would be fine. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "Kira, do you remember when I told you about bravery? How it's not about not being scared, but about doing what's right even when you are scared?" She nodded, and he continued. "Well, I'm scared too, but I have to go, Because there might be other kids out there who need help, just like you did." Kira was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. Then, with a determination that surprised him, she tore her dark drawing from the pad and started a new one. This time she reached for a yellow crayon. "I'm going to draw you a good luck charm," she said, her voice stronger now. "You have to promise to keep it with you." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. "I promise," he said softly. An hour later, Marcus found himself in a tactical vehicle, heading towards the location of the suspected trafficking operation. In his pocket was Kira's drawing, a bright yellow sun breaking through dark clouds. Detective Sanchez sat beside him, briefing the team on last-minute intelligence. As they neared their destination, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, but the message chilled him to the bone. "Watch your back, Reed. Harrigan sends his regards." Marcus showed the message to Sanchez, whose face hardened. "It's a setup," she said grimly. "Harrigan's playing us from behind bars." The team quickly recalibrated, approaching the target location with even more caution. As they surrounded the building, Marcus's military instincts kicked into high gear. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Just as they were about to breach the main entrance, Marcus spotted movement in a second-story window. "Sniper!" he yelled, tackling Sanchez to the ground as a shot rang out. Chaos erupted. The operation devolved into a firefight, with Marcus and the team pinned down behind their vehicles. As bullets whizzed overhead, Marcus's hand instinctively went to his pocket, feeling the folded paper of Kira's drawing. In that moment, as the world exploded into violence around him, Marcus made a silent vow. He would make it through this, not just for himself or for justice, but for Kira and all the children counting on him. He had promised to come back, and he intended to keep that promise. With renewed determination, Marcus began coordinating with Sanchez and the team. They had walked into a trap, yes, but they were far from defeated. As sirens wailed in the distance, signaling incoming backup, Marcus knew that this battle was far from over. The fight against the trafficking ring had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. But as Marcus readied himself to rejoin the fray, he felt a strange sense of calm. He had found his purpose, his new mission, and no matter what Harrigan or his associates threw at them, Marcus was ready to face it head-on. For Kira, for all the children still out there needing rescue, he would keep fighting. The road ahead was treacherous, but Marcus Reed was no stranger to difficult battles, and this he knew with bone-deep certainty was a war worth winning.